Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate fourth track, new track at this conference, Soft Skills. Are you crazy? What are you doing here? Thank you for coming. I appreciate learning more about the important stuff. It's all important, but this is equally as important. So a caveat, the hidden requirements, exploring emotions with placebos, as I mentioned a few of you, this was originally designed to be a half or full day workshop. I've recently given it as an hour keynote. I think I have less than an hour to get out of here for the next group coming in. So I'm going to talk fast, but I will get faster. So strap yourselves in because I'm going to blast you with a fire hose of information here. All the interaction of the workshop gone. All the exercises gone. It's just going to be tons of info blasted at you, unidirectional. All right? You ready? Let's do this. The obligatory About Me slide. My name's Damian Synadinos, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. My company is Ineffable Solutions. If you're on the Twitters, there's my Twitter handle. You can hit me up there. I'm a lot of different things. We're all a lot of different things. Here's a few labels that I think might be relevant to today. I'm going to tie them to the topic. I'm a tester. I taught myself BASIC on a TRS-80 color computer in the 80s in 4th grade. So I'm dating myself there. I dropped out of Ohio State University to start testing. I got into the QA department at CompuServe back in 1993, if anyone's even heard of that company. Over the next 24 years, I did software testing at about 15 different companies all around Central Ohio. I've done automated testing, a lot of different tools and methodologies, so I write a lot of tests to test other applications. I've been in a lot of different methodologies of ways we build software, waterfall, agile, fragile, all those. I've been in a lot of different roles, from individual contributor to manager. I've worked with onshore and offshore teams. I've worked at companies of 30 people, companies of 30,000 people. I've done consulting at full time. I've done a lot of testing in my career. The last 5 years I've been involved with the QA or the Highway Conference. I'm one of the organizers. I keynoted it last year. More recently, I started my company. I've been speaking about testing topics and other topics for about 4 years. 2 years ago, I started my company, Ineffable Solutions, to do it full time. So now I travel around the world doing training and talks at companies and corporations, mostly on soft skills that are applicable to, yes, testing and tech, but also many other things. They're really kind of fundamental life skills. So here's a couple labels. I already talked about tester. I'm an improviser. I have 10 years of improvisation experience, like whose line is it anyway, that type of thing. Hundreds of shows over 10 years. I'm a speaker, as I said. I started my company 2 years ago. This is what I do full time. Welcome. How you doing? I'm just introducing myself. No big deal. I'm an artist. I've been drawing since I was a child anymore. I just draw for family and friends. But I also draw a lot of my slides. Not today, but that led to me being an author. I illustrated and authored a children's book about improvisation. It's on Amazon. Hank and Stella and Something from Nothing, if you're interested in those things, kids and improv. I'm a husband. That took me 2 tries. But the second one produced 2 kids. I'm a father ×2. Alina's 7, Zach is 5. So these are a few of the titles that I am. We're all a lot of different things. But these I listed up here today because they all have something in common. They all regard emotions in different ways. As a tester, I have to be sensitive to emotions. If I find a bug in an application, I have to be sensitive and tactful because I might be bringing what's perceived as bad news to somebody, telling them that something that they did is incorrect. That involves emotions. As an improviser, I'm trying to connect with other people on stage and the audience, perhaps emotionally, to make them feel something. As a speaker, I'm trying to influence you and affect you emotionally as a speaker. I'm trying to connect with you, inspire, motivate, different things. An artist, I'm trying to evoke emotions perhaps through nonverbal means, maybe through drawings or picture or sculpture. Artists evoke emotions. As an author, same thing. I'm trying to evoke emotions in the parents that read to their kids and the kids themselves in these books. A husband and father. Different types of emotions I relate to with my wife and my kids. Now, what does this mean? We all have the same types of experiences with emotions. We're all lifelong experience with emotions. Are any of us experts? I'm certainly not. I'm not even sure what an expert is. That's a fuzzy word. But what I'm going to talk about today is experience-based. Partly on this, all the different things that I am, all the different ways that I deal with emotions in my life. And based on this experience, I've supplemented it with research. So these topics I'm going to talk about today are experience-based and research-hardened. I've dug into these topics to learn more about them. So I'm going to talk about things that I've found to be useful and relevant and valuable to me in my context. Hopefully you'll find some parallels and it might be useful and valuable to you in your context as well. All right. Why? Why are we here? I like Simon Sinek. Start with the why. I think it's important to understand the reasons, the goals, the purpose that we do things. And if you understand those, it can help guide what you do and how you do those things. So why? Why are you here? Not rhetorical. Why are you here?
To learn.
To learn. Fantastic answer. Why are you here? Why'd you choose this session? Are you spill over from another more popular session? You're like, eh. Why'd you come here today? Yes?
Just interested on the topic, really. Like handling the emotions of, like, well, we've got this massive merge request. How do we handle that? You know, going like, hey, buddy, you might want to chop that down a bit.
Okay, wonderful, great. Why are you here? What are you trying to get out of today, besides this room? Yes. Awesome, right in line with the learning. Good. More information, always a good thing. So everyone probably has different reasons, whether you made them explicit or not, that you're here today. So I'll suggest another reason why you might be here today, and I'll suggest that reason with a claim. The way we feel about software is important. I believe this to be true, but with any claim, it helps if you support that claim with facts and evidence and proof. So how am I going to do that, support this claim? Today I'm going to start with quotations. I'm going to start with quotes from famous, notable people that will support the claim that the way we feel about software is important. The purpose of software, again, back to the why. Why are we here? Why do we make software? I'm going to talk about that and try and relate it to the emotions and emotional considerations of software. Research, I'm going to talk about people that are smarter and have been looking into this a lot longer than I have, that have researched this topic. Finally, I'll support my claim by looking at requirements. We all have used and perhaps even create requirements. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper to get a better, deeper understanding of what are requirements exactly. By that point, hopefully you're on board and I've supported the claim enough that you say, okay, so now what? So now what? The second part is emotional requirements. What are these emotional requirements that you're suggesting? How do we get them? How do we test them? And finally, in the title of the talk, I mentioned placebos. This is something that I think will give us a different lens, a different way to look at software that might be relevant and helpful as we're thinking about emotional considerations in software. All right, let's hit it. Quotations. I'm going to give you some quotes from famous, notable people. Now you're saying, oh, so you're going to appeal to authority and appeal to emotion. Those are logical fallacies. Those are bad things. Sometimes. Appeal to authority can be bad if you're appealing to an authority that is not relevant for that particular topic. If I'm going to give you a quote about LeBron James, but it's about quantum mechanics, maybe that's not a relevant authority. But if that particular authority is relevant to that topic, maybe you should listen to what they have to say, or at least consider it. So I'll leave that up to you to decide whether this particular person is an authority in the topic that we're talking about, and if what they have to say is relevant. That's up to you to decide. Second thing, appeal to emotion. Sometimes an appeal to emotion, you say something, you're trying to make them feel a certain way, but you're manipulating them. That's a bad way. That's the logical fallacy. But sometimes facts and statements that have evidence and support can also make you feel a certain way. In that case, there's nothing wrong with an appeal to emotion. So I'll be quoting some people today, and it may make you feel a certain way, and it's up to you to decide whether the way that you feel is appropriate and what I'm trying to talk about. So the first quote comes from Dale Carnegie, the American writer. When dealing with people, remember you are not dealing with creatures of logic, but with creatures of emotion. I like this quote for a variety of reasons, because we are emotional creatures. I grew up with the original series Star Trek, so my favorite character was Spock, and now Data in the Next Generation. So I always thought, boy, wouldn't it be great to be Data or Spock and just purely work on logic, be able to decide everything. In fact, it would be awful. There's Radiolab. Anybody ever heard of that? The NPR podcast. There's a wonderful episode that has a segment on it about a doctor that studies people with brain trauma, and they've had something that has affected their brain, either through accidents or disease. And a few particular cases, there was some people that had the area of their brain that allows them to feel and affect emotion was damaged, so they could no longer feel emotion, otherwise normal. And they had one case that they were talking about, and this person had an accident, they recovered, and they were otherwise back to their normal self, except for one thing: they couldn't feel emotion. So what was different about them? They were paralyzed by decision making. Simple decisions were very, very difficult, sometimes impossible for them to make. And they give a couple examples. They're sitting at work and someone brings them a document and says, hey, I need your signature. And they look down and there's a blue pen and a black pen. Well, the black pen matches the color of the ink on the document, so maybe it makes sense and that would be more consistent. But the blue pen would stand out more. Maybe my signature needs to stand out. But the black pen is closer and the blue pen is farther away. But the black pen has more ink. And they would go through this very reasonable, logical way. But without emotions, they had difficulty choosing which pen to sign a document. This person said that when they went to the cereal aisle of their local grocery store, it was paralyzing. All the different caloric content and all the boxes and all the different things, they could not choose a box of cereal because they were unable to feel emotion. There's lots and lots of other brain scientists that have done studies on this, and in fact, all of our decisions, whether you realize it or not, are to some degree affected by emotion. Emotion allows us to make our decisions, to help us think, do, and say everything that we do. So we are not dealing with creatures of logic, we are dealing with creatures of emotion. Another quote, Maya Angelou. This is a very old idea that Maya Angelou has made more recent and popular. She says, I've learned that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. I love this quote, and I find it to be true personally. For example, I can think about times with my family or friends and I'm recounting a story. I say, boy, do you remember that time we were on our way to Kings Island and you told that funny joke? It was great. And I laughed so hard. And they go, well, we were on our way to Cedar Point and it wasn't a joke, it was a story. I'm like, oh, I forget the details, the granular things. I don't remember what they said exactly or what they did, but I remember how it made me feel. That's true for me, and I assume that it's true for a lot of us. We're very much in tune with our emotions, even if we forget the details. This idea, again, represented by Maya Angelou, is central to the business models of a lot of other famous people. A lot of people have said this is the keystone idea that we use to form our entire business. People such as Richard Branson, Virgin Group founder. He says that Maya Angelou quote and the ideas represented in it were central to him as a founder of Virgin. He said, customers shouldn't think of your business as a place to buy a product or use a service. It should be a fun place to be. If you know anything about Richard Branson or if you know anything about Virgin, it is a fun place to work. It's a fun, they try and inject fun into all of their products and services. He understands that fun and emotion is central to having a successful business. Another person that mentions that Maya Angelou quote was central to their business is Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks. He says, Starbucks has a role in a meaningful relationship with people that is not only about the coffee. Success is very shallow if it doesn't have emotional meaning. I want to read a quote because I love it. He was interviewed by Oprah Winfrey, and he was talking about before he started Starbucks, he went over to Italy for a trip, and he walked into an Italian cafe. And he says, I was out of my mind. I walked in and saw a symphony of activity, and the romance of theater of coffee, and coffee at the center of conversation, and the sense of community. That's what spoke to me. And he says when he came back to the States, he wasn't intending on bringing coffee back. He was intending on bringing back the experience, the feeling that he had when he walked into that cafe in Italy. Just so happened that coffee and coffee shops were the means by which he was able to bring this experience back. And I think by some measure of success, by some measuring stick, it's reasonable to say that Starbucks is a successful company and Howard Schultz is a successful person. Another person that says that quote was important, George Blankenship, Apple, Tesla, we're not selling you anything. We want you to feel differently when you leave the store. Emotionally engage the customers, don't transactionally engage them. I like this quote because it compares emotionally engaging someone and transactionally engaging them. Oftentimes, as we create the software that we create, we might be thinking about functional and performance and all these very tangible types of requirements. And how do we transact with the customer? What does this do when we don't necessarily think about how does it make them feel? We don't emotionally engage customers. But he is saying that we should. Finally, Debbie Fields of Mrs. Fields Cookies. I've never felt like I was in the cookie business. She says, I've always been in a feel-good feeling business. My job is to sell joy, it's to sell happiness, to sell an experience. She really is promoting this idea that it's not about cookies, it's not about coffee, it's not about planes, it's about fun and feeling and emotions and emotionally engaging with your customers. So why is all of this important? Successful businesses, by some measuring stick, and people recognize the importance of emotion. They say that emotion is central to the success of their business and their own personal success. Moving on, purpose of software. I liked starting with the why, so why do we make software? Now, a couple caveats. I have purpose of software. Some people might say, what is the purpose of software? The purpose implies that there's one purpose. If you know anything about causality, cause and effect, you'll know that there's never a one-to-one relationship between cause and effect. It's never a one-to-many or even a many-to-one. It's always, always, always a many-to-many. There's always many things that cause many other things. You might focus on just a few, but that's the way causality and the world works. So rather than say the purpose of software, it's probably more reasonable to say a purpose of software. There's many reasons that we make software. What I'm going to talk about today is looking for a primary reason, one that floats to the top and is general and applies to all software, which is the second caveat. What do I mean when I say software? Software is a pretty general term and it has a wide umbrella of sub-meanings. Is it application software, system software, all sorts of different types of software. What I'm going to propose and search for in this talk is a purpose of software that's general enough to apply to all software. On board? All right, so what is a purpose of software specifically, meaning in some specific set of circumstances, in some particular context? The answer is infinite. There are infinite reasons that we make software. Maybe we make software to help you browse the internet, or to crunch numbers, or to save the Princess Toadstool, or to monitor your heart rate, or to land or fly airplanes, or to sell sweaters. There's infinite reasons that we might make software. But that is not very satisfying if we're talking about a purpose that's general and applies to more software. So I went digging deeper and I started to find more general answers. Generally, it's to organize information, to collect and process data. Organize information was or maybe is Google's mission, to organize the world's data. or organize the world's information, to collect and process data. Certainly that's more general than to fly or land a plane or to sell a sweater, and applies to more types of software, but still not all software. What about to simplify or automate a workload? That also applies to a lot more software, a larger set of what we might call software, but not all software. A video game might not be said to simplify or automate workload. What about somebody says, to maximize shareholder profit? Now that might be relevant to all software. All software is intended at some point along the line to maximize shareholder profit. But Jack Welch, CEO of General Electric, says shareholder profit should be a result, not a purpose or a goal. A result of software, a result of running a business. So I didn't like these answers. They were more general and generic, but it still didn't satisfy me. So I dug deeper. I found a really great answer. This was by Stanislaw Christian. He has a blog post where he talks about all software is intended to be useful. A good software product is above all useful if the end product meets most of the business requirements to deliver value to the stakeholders, is successful. I thought, okay, that seems very, very general to me. All software could be said to be useful in some way, shape, or form. So the next logical question is useful to who? To how? To help people. This comes from Max Kanat Alexander, author of Code Simplicity, and he suggests that all software is intended to help people, either directly or indirectly, or indirectly. All software is intended to be useful to help people. And he also understands that this is relative. What's helpful to one person might be harmful or hindering to another person. And back to the useful part, you might say that, well, is there anything that is not useful in any way at all? Forget software. Is it even possible to have anything, this is a philosophical kind of sidetrack, is it possible for something to have no use, no value at all? I say no. And if somebody says, well, I found something that has absolutely contextless, no value at all, I'd say that's amazing, because that is a great example of something with no value. They're so rare. So everything has value if you add some context to it. Anyway, purpose of software. I think it's reasonable to say it's to be useful, to help people do what? The most popular and general answer I found was to solve problems. All software is intended to solve some type of problem. I like this answer. It applies to any type of software I could think about, that there is some type of problem, the software helps address that problem in some way. But it's made me start to think, what exactly is a problem? What is a solution? So I dug into that. What is a problem? What is a solution? So if you're familiar with problems and solutions, you're familiar with things. They're just things. Things are anything that's physical, any thought, any idea, any action. These are all just things. And things have attributes or characteristics or qualities that make one thing different from all other things. What makes a chair and not a table? What makes a table and not a cat? Attributes or characteristics, essential characteristics that make that thing, and not another thing. In definitions in linguistics and language, these are called the differentia. In a dictionary definition, the differentia are the things that make that definition apply to that word and not every other word in the dictionary. So I started thinking, okay, I'm trying to understand what are problems and what are solutions. What are the essential characteristics of problems and solutions? What are the things that make a problem and a solution a solution? Now, if you start to look up definitions of problems and solutions, you'll find scads of them. I looked at many, many sources, many dictionaries, many blogs, many articles, and what I've come up with is a definition of my own that I think contains the essential characteristics of a problem. Before I get to that, let me give you an example because you might be a little lost with this whole essential characteristics thing. Let's take a square. A reasonable definition of square is a figure with 4 equal straight sides and 4 right angles. What are the essential characteristics of a square being a square? It has how many sides? Not 7 or 2. It has exactly 4. That makes the thing a square. But it can't, just because it has 4 sides doesn't necessarily mean it's square. Those sides have to be equal in length. They have to be straight. And what about the angles? It has to have exactly 4 and they have to be at right. If any of these things are violated, that thing you're talking about might not be reasonable to call that thing a square. But if all of these essential characteristics are met, then it's probably reasonable to label that thing with the label square. So that's a square. It meets all those characteristics, the essential characteristics. That's a square. It's smaller, but the size of a square is not essential to being a square. It's not a characteristic or an attribute of a square, size. That's a square. Color is not an essential characteristic. Squares can be many different colors. Orientation. Doesn't matter which way you turn it, it's still a square. Some people might call it a diamond. What about that? Not a square because the sides aren't equal. It violates some of the essential characteristics. Not a square for violates all sorts of different essential characteristics. Not reasonable to call those things squares. So, what are the essential characteristics of a problem? Again, my definition. An undesirable state that differs from some desirable state. If you find something you say, I've got a real problem here, and I say, oh, is it undesirable to you? You said it's your problem. Is it undesirable? And you say, no, I'm okay with it. I'd say, well, is it really reasonable to call that thing a problem then? Maybe not. What if they say, oh, I've got a problem and it's undesirable. Okay, is it different from some desirable state? If not, then maybe it's not reasonable to call that a problem. How about solutions? Just flip it around. A solution is a desirable state that differs from some undesirable state. Hey, thank goodness, we finally found a solution. Do you want this solution? No, I hate it. Well, then is it reasonable to call that a solution? Maybe you can call it something else, but it's not a solution. So really, you're going from an undesirable state to a desirable state. Desire, that's an emotion. So let's go back. Emotions are an essential characteristic of problems and solutions. Anytime you're talking about a problem and you're talking about a solution, an essential characteristic of those things is an emotion. Let's go all the way back. Purpose of software, to be useful. How? To help people. To do what? To solve problems. Why? To affect emotion. All software, a purpose of all software is to affect emotion. So I thought this was a pretty reasonable, logical conclusion based on all my research and reading. But I'm a tester and I test things, including ideas and claims. So I wanted to test this idea. Is this always true? Purpose of software to affect emotion unless you find yourself with a monopoly and it's a necessity. What I mean by that is, let's say I make some piece of software. And I'm the only person that makes this software. I'm the only place you can get it. I'm a monopoly. And this particular piece of software, you absolutely got it, positively got to have it. For some purpose, the only way you can achieve that purpose is with this software, and I'm the only place you can get it. Guess what? I probably don't care about your emotions. I don't need to. Because regardless of how you feel, even if you hate my product, I'm the only place you can get it, and it's a necessity for some particular purpose. However, this is a rare case. Most of the time, there's some piece of software that's necessary. You got to have it, but there's a lot of places you can get it. Or the opposite. There's some software where there's only one place to get it, but it's just a nice to have. You don't need it, you just want it. In both of those cases, emotions play a part. If you need some piece of software and there's a lot of places to get it, people will likely go to the one that makes them feel the way they want to feel. Or if there's a piece of software that's not necessary, it's just a nice to have, people might not want it unless it makes them feel a certain way. So, a purpose of software is to affect emotion. I think this applies to all software, all categories of software, and it's general enough to apply generally. Research, all right, another appeal to authority, but this time more relevant people that have dived specifically into emotional considerations in software. There are a few studies in the literature that specifically address the relation between emotions and software. This comes from a 2014 paper. This was one of the first papers I found, and unfortunately this quote is very, very true. There's not a lot of research in this area. Not a lot of people have done studies, case studies, theses, dissertations on the idea of emotional importance of software development. So there's not a lot of papers, and interestingly enough, when you go back, all the papers build on one another. They start to reference each other, so they're all building on prior research. This is just a small sampling of some of the papers, white papers, dissertations that I've looked at in my research. If you want the full list of resources, I'd be happy to give them to you afterwards. But I'm going to quote a few things from, again, Appeal to Authority that I think are relevant to this talk. From a 2005 paper, Is Emotion Relevant to Requirements Engineering? We argue that emotions are just as important and valid as factors affecting requirements as any other traditional factors, such as cost, performance, functionality, UI, UX. They say the emotions are just as important. That was the conclusion of this research team in this particular paper. 1 year later, in 2006, Emotional Requirements in Video Games, they came to this conclusion from their research. The induced emotional state is the most important deliverable requirement. Any functionality that exists only to further that emotional goal. Player acceptance, market success is driven by the realization of this set of non-functional emotional requirements. Now, this comes from video games. The most research that I found comes from this area because purpose of software to help people solve problems. A primary purpose of the software that they make at Abercrombie & Fitch is to sell sweaters. That's a primary purpose. A primary purpose of video games is to affect emotion. If emotion is so important in video games, it makes sense that the most research I found comes from the video game industry. The second most important, medical software. Now, of course, doctors want their software to perform and function as expected, but a good doctor's primary concern is their patient's well-being. And if that is true, then the people that make the software for a doctor better make sure that the software makes them feel a certain way as they take care of their patients, the primary concern of a doctor. So anyway, they say it's not just as important, it is the most important deliverable requirement, these emotional considerations. Okay, so you're on board. What can you do about it? This paper suggests modeling emotional requirements, 2014, back to that one. One way to produce better systems is explore users' emotions to uncover the hidden requirements that may otherwise be ignored. They say explore the emotions of your users and use them as you go ahead and build the system. As an example of that, this is a mouthful of a title. Adopting Information Technology is the First Step in Design Lessons Learned from Working with Brazilian Social Workers, 2003. Here's the story, what happened. A group of developers was engaged by the Brazilian government. The Brazilian government said, hey, we have a group of social workers, they do this work, they've used the software, they don't like it, they're not accepting it. We need you to come in and redevelop it, redesign the software. What these developers did is instead of just start collecting requirements, they went and they used a method called UDUM, which I'll talk about later, to sit with these Brazilian social workers, understand their dreams, their motives, their passions, their ideology, what drives them. And they used their answers to help design the requirements for this application. And the epilogue of the story is the application was indeed accepted by these Brazilian social workers. What they found was these social workers did this work for free. It wasn't because they wanted status increase or money. They did it out of goodwill. And so they wanted to make sure that the software reflected these ideas and ideals of these social workers. And they said the developers recognize that volunteers are motivated not for money or advancement, but for their own satisfaction. So the software should reflect those emotions. Following? So why does this matter? Again, the way people feel about a technology can determine whether that technology is embraced or rejected by its intended users. We all make software in some way, shape, or form. We all contribute to making it. If having your software embraced by users is important, then perhaps you should consider the way people feel about a technology. So, research by people smarter and have been doing this longer than me, suggests that emotional requirements can influence software acceptance and should be considered. All right, Finally, I've been including all these Calvin and Hobbes cartoons because I found ones that I think are relevant to each section. This particular one talks about wants and needs, and I'll get to that in a moment. So what are requirements? I'm going to dig a little bit deeper than perhaps you've considered requirements in the past. Requirements, a reasonable definition in the context of software, is any particular thing or goal that a system should be or do, some attribute of a system or something a system does. And maybe depending on how you make software in your context, in your shop, you've seen requirements written in these ways. A system should be or do some particular thing, or if you're more agile-ish, as a role, I want goals so that benefit. So we're probably familiar with these different ways that we write down requirements. And here's a whole bunch, a little word cloud of different requirements that you've probably encountered during your career. Functional, business, customer, UI, UX. There's all these different ways that we write requirements. But today I'm interested in something more general. What are requirements more generally? Again, I looked at many definitions and came up with this definition that contains the essential characteristics. A requirement is a thing that is wanted or needed. Anything that is wanted or needed, that's a requirement. So you're working with your customers, your stakeholders, your end users, and they say, I got a list of requirements. Remember, those are things that they want or need. Great, so what are wants and needs? A want is something that's desired. A need is something that's necessary. That's all it is. When somebody says, I have a requirement, what they're really asking for is something that they want or something that they need, something that's necessary. So let's dig in this a little bit more. Perhaps you've seen this poster, Uncle Sam, I want you. The history of this, 1917, James Flagg, the author, and he looked in a mirror. That's his own likeness. That's the author's image. He drew this as a recruitment poster, and it was actually for a cover of a magazine, Leslie's Weekly, and it was eventually used for recruitment purposes. I want you. What you might not know is 3 years earlier, in 1914, this poster came out. So the one on the left over here, Uncle Sam, that's a copy of this one. This was by artist Alfred Leet, and he had, that's Lord, what the heck was that guy's name? Yeah, it doesn't matter. The country needs you. So this is a copy of this poster. Now, obviously, there's artistic license. One artist decided to make a goatee and change the colors and make more of the chest. So there's all sorts of visual changes that the artist decided to make. But what was interesting to me is one says needs and one says want. Why do you think when James Flagg created this poster that he changed the wording from needs to want? And more importantly, I'd ask you, this is the only other non-rhetorical question of the time, how do these make you feel? Do they make you feel the same or do they make you feel different? Yes.
Your country needs you feels more like it's your duty to do that, but I want you feels like, oh, I want you to volunteer to do this thing. And it seems more, what is it, I guess emotionally evoking to go like, oh, I'm wanted, cool.
Wrong. No, that's a wonderful answer. That's a great answer, absolutely. Anybody else want to share? That's a great answer. Yes? Okay. Anybody else? The point is that they do make you feel differently. Now, what if they were switched around? What if the original poster was Uncle Sam said, I need you, and this one said, I want you? There was an interesting analysis of both of these, and the online, and the author wrote, they evoke patriotism and guilt. I'm sorry, the one that says needs. They evoke patriotism and guilt in those yet to enlist without straying as far as to be emotional blackmail. I really like that statement. The words want and need, which again are just two things that make up what a requirement is, can make us feel different ways, just the words alone. But I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. So a requirement's a thing that's wanted or needed. Great, I'm on board with that so far, Damian, but how can I tell the difference between a want or a need? How do I know if it's this or that? Here's a little formula that might give you insight to help you decide. First, identify the requirement. Let's call it X. Okay, I require this. Let's call that thing X. Next is establish a purpose of X, or the in some particular context. What's the purpose of X? Let's call that Y. So I require X for the purpose of Y. So far, this might seem familiar because this is really just the 5 whys technique, a root cause analysis technique. Keep asking why, and every time you ask that, ask again and again and again. You dig deeper, and you get deeper understanding of a problem. So far, this is just a restatement of the 5 whys, a bad name for a great technique of digging down and understanding. But I add on a third step, which is ask, can the purpose Y be achieved without the requirement X? If the answer is yes, then X is just something you want. If the answer is no, then X is needed. So if I want to achieve Y, and I can't achieve Y without X, then I need X. I can't get to Y without it. But if I can get to Y by some other means, then I just want X. So this is a little algorithm, and I don't mean, actually I shouldn't call it an algorithm. It's more of a heuristic that can give you insight into whether something may or may not be a want or a need. So I'll give you an example. What if somebody said, I require a library card? Okay, well, why do you, that's the requirement. What's the purpose of this? There's a lot of different reasons that somebody might have it, but for this particular context, in this particular story, the reason is, there's the requirement, library card. The reason is to check out books from the library. For this story, that's why I need a library card. So, ask, can I check out books from the library without a library card? Well, I can steal them, but that's not checking them out. And the requirement was checking them out. So can I check out books? Maybe I can use my ID, but really you need a library card. So the answer is no, I can't check out books from the library without a library card. Therefore, a library card is a need. So somebody gave me a requirement. I was able to use this little formula and gain insight and say, this is probably something that's necessary. You can't achieve your purpose without this. So this requirement is absolutely needed. I'll go further into this. Let's start, and this gets interesting as you dig down using that 5 whys technique. Library card is a requirement. Why do you need it? To check out books. Can you do it without it? Nope, you need it. Let's do it again. I have a new requirement. I want to check out books. That's for my requirement. Well, why do you need it, Damian? Well, in this little story, I need it to gain knowledge. That's why I need to check out books. Well, can I gain knowledge in any other way besides checking out books? Sure, I can go online, I can talk to people. So checking out books is just something I want to do, this requirement. What about my next requirement? I require to gain knowledge. Okay, why do you want to do that? I want to learn how to cook. Okay, is learning how to cook something I want or need? Can I learn how to cook any other way without gaining knowledge? Can you learn anything without gaining knowledge? No, to learn means gaining knowledge. So gaining knowledge is necessary to learning how to cook. Okay, why do you want to learn how to cook, Damian? To impress someone. That's my story, this is my story. So I want to impress someone, and I say, I want to impress someone, and they say, why? To learn how to cook. Is the only way to achieve impressing them learning how to cook? Maybe not. Maybe I can do a cool dance, or I can show off, and they'll like that. So maybe learning how to cook is just something I want to do because I think it will achieve this goal. Then maybe it's not necessary. I want to impress someone. Why? I want to date that person. Okay, Damian, is there any other way you can date them by impressing them? Perhaps. Maybe it's just something I want. Maybe they think I'm sweet and it's not about impressing them. Okay, I want to date them. Why do you want to do that? To feel happy. Okay, Damian, is there any other way you can feel happy other than dating them? Maybe a warm bath, maybe a piece of chocolate also makes me feel happy. So dating them is also a want. All right, my new requirement is to feel happy. Why do you want to feel happy? What's the purpose of feeling happy? Now, this is a rhetorical question, a philosophical rabbit hole that you go down. I'm not sure if it's a want or need. This is something I still struggle with. And I have gone down this, and it's an interesting side conversation if you're interested afterwards. Doesn't matter whether it's a want or need for this particular talk. What's interesting is, if you dig down far enough, very often you'll find yourself in one of two places. You'll find yourself at a moral dead end. You're doing something or because it's right, because it's moral, because it's ethical. Or you'll find yourself at a core emotion. So somebody says, I require to log in. I require this software application. I require a library card. You dig down deep enough, and there's a good chance you'll land at emotion because it makes them feel a certain way. Why is this important? Because requirements are simply wants or needs. And those words alone can affect emotions. Just saying the word want, to your point, or need can make people feel certain different ways. And also, requirements often originate from emotions. If you dig down deep enough, there's a good chance that that original requirement of logging in or software or library card came from some very core emotion. Okay, so the way we feel about software is important. So far, I think I've supported my case reasonably, and you should be on board that, yeah, okay, it's reasonable to say that the way we feel about software is important. So now what, Damian? All right, good Lord. Emotional requirements. Let's talk about these things very quickly. We've already talked about the definition of requirement in a software context. This is what it might look like. What about an emotional requirement? This is what it might look like. A particular feeling as opposed to a thing or goal that a system should induce in a particular user. So if you're serious and interested in going back to your particular shop and your company and saying, hey, I just learned this interesting idea. I think it's important the way we feel about software. I'd like to bring the idea of emotional requirements into our company and start developing these. They say, well, how do you write them? Here you go. This might be one way. You can jot this down, take a picture, and say, well, I have at least some template that we can use to inspire us and come up with our own answer. So what about system formats? Again, depending on how you develop software in your shop, requirements might be something that the system should be or do, or a role, you want goal. What about emotional requirements? Maybe the system should be or do something to induce a feeling in a particular person. Or what about if you're in an agile shop, as a role, I want this particular goal. Why? Not for the benefit, for some feeling. So it changes the focus a little bit from some functional requirement of performance, security, availability, maintainability, scalability, portability, all the zillions of abilities, and it changes the focus a little bit to an emotional consideration. Following? I'm going pretty fast. All right, so what are some of the things you should consider while you're creating these emotional requirements? The first is, what feeling are you trying to induce? What emotion do you want to induce in that particular person? Here are 8 base emotions that come from, I always forget this guy's name, Paul Ekman. And it was later on by the other guy that built on this, Robert Plutchik. Anyway, these are guys that have done a lot of emotional research. And they identified these 8 base emotions. Now, these are a fantastic starting point. But Wittgenstein had a wonderful quote, "The limits of my language is the limits of my world." If you have a limited vocabulary, while you may be able to feel heat and pain and be tired, if you don't have words to express those ideas, you can't conceptualize them. So if you have a limited emotional vocabulary, you're not going to be able to accurately describe in emotional requirements all the different ways that you want your users to feel. So this is called an emotion wheel. It's one of the many, I don't expect you to read it, but you can look it up. It's one of the many ways that people have taken these 8 base emotions and expanded them into very, very nuanced feelings. So if you're really serious about getting emotional requirements and using them as you build your software, I encourage you to increase your emotional vocabulary. Learn more ways to express emotions. Then as you're saying, when the product does this or when the product performs in this way, we want the users to feel more than just anger or disgust, fear, joy. You can have more nuanced ways of describing it. What else should you consider? The target, the role of the user. In whom do you want to induce this emotion? Everyone's different. One person, you design something to make this person feel happy. That very same thing may make someone else feel not happy. So you have to consider, are we building it for this person or that person? Consider the role, the demographics, all the things about that particular user, and take that into consideration when you're trying to induce that feeling in them. The context, the set of circumstances, all the details around this that might matter. For instance, one thing to consider is, okay, we've designed this thing and we intend for it to make the user feel satisfied. Okay, do we think we've done it? Yeah. Okay, let's have this user try it. Cool, their dog just died, now they're going to sit down and use it. Does that matter? Their prior emotional state before they use it? Perhaps. Maybe you say, well, what about the guy that just won the lottery? 2 people side by side. One won the lottery, the other one's dog died. They're both using the application. One goes, it stinks. The other goes, I love it. Might their prior emotional state, that's part of the context you might want to consider, have a factor into this. And how much does it matter in your shop? That's a question for you to answer on your own. All right, how do you get emotional requirements? Here's the practical bit, and it's super high level, intended to inspire for you to go off and research and read and learn on your own, again, if you're serious about doing this in your shop. Now, how do you get emotional requirements? This is just a bullet point list, and I'll quickly talk about them. First is interviews and discussions. If you're fortunate enough to have access to the customers, whether direct or indirect customers, speak with them, interview them, maybe one-on-one, maybe small focus groups, maybe large groups. Talk to them, discuss back and forth. Learn, what do you want? How do you want this thing to make you feel? That's the best way to find out. This is very similar to the way that those developers did in that Brazilian when they made the software for the Brazilian social workers. They used a particular method that I'll talk about in a moment, but really they discussed and they sat and they talked to their end users and said, how do you want this to feel? When you're doing your job as a social worker, how do you want to make it feel? And they said, well, we want to feel a satisfaction. That seems pretty important. They wrote it down and they built software that helped to make them feel satisfied. Interviews, discussions, surveys, polls, and questionnaires. If you can't sit and talk with them, maybe you can shoot them emails or questionnaires. Now, there's tons of information that you should learn about this to create effective interviews, surveys, polls, and questionnaires. Questions, perhaps you've heard of open versus closed questions. Many of us have heard of that distinction. But there's many, many subcategories. Those are macro categories. Closed question is anyone, it's not just binary, which is yes or no, black or white. A closed question is anyone that limits the amount of responses that you can give. A rating is a closed type of question. That might be appropriate sometimes, but it might not be appropriate sometimes. There's probing questions, follow-up questions, meta questions, all sorts of different types of questions that have different purposes. Watch out for double-barreled questions where you say, does it annoy you when someone's late for work and they chew with their mouth open? Well, maybe one annoys you, but the other doesn't, so it's impossible to answer that question because you've made a double-barreled question. So split them up. Watch out for leading or loading questions. There's all sorts of research you can do to find out how to ask effective questions. Surveys and polls. Remember, when you're surveying people, there's rating, there's ranking. On a scale of 1 to 10, how did this make you feel very happy or not very happy? Or ranking, hey, list these emotions in order of importance to you, from most important to least important. There's all sorts of different ways you can create polls, surveys, and questionnaires to gain insight into the way that your customers want to feel. Another one, observation. Maybe you're fortunate enough to watch your customers using a prior version of your product or doing their job manually. Remember, one purpose of software might be to automate or simplify a workload. Maybe you can go and observe them and actually watch. And while they're doing their job, their brow is furrowed and they're very angry, and you go, oh, they don't seem to like this part of their job, and you write that down. Another part, they're smiling. Oh, they really enjoy this. While we make our software, we should probably make sure that they keep smiling during this part and make sure that they're not frowning anymore when we build this part. Now, watch out for the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is that when people are being observed, sometimes it affects how they do things. So somebody says, oh, geez, he's watching me, and they're just going to keep smiling, even though they might not be smiling inside. So there's ways to get around this that I'm not going to get into today, but research the Hawthorne effect so that your observation does not affect the outcome of the results. If you're unlucky and you can't get and talk to all of your users, perhaps you can pretend by using personas. Anybody not familiar with personas? That's a stupid question. Who's going to, I don't know them. So personas, for those that don't know, are basically made-up characters, pretend potential users of your particular system. It describes their age, their demographics, their hopes, their dreams, where they're from, all these different things. And based on that, you can use that as an atypical or archetypal user of your system. So, well, I can't talk to the 40-year-old mother in Iowa who's probably going to use our system, but I know enough about them, maybe based on data or historic data, that I can build a persona. And I can say, well, while we're trying to figure out how to induce this emotion in what user? That 40-year-old mother from Iowa, and here's a reasonable description of her. Even though we can't observe her, interview her, talk to her, we can use this persona to help us as we try and develop the software. Others, ethnography, UDUM, that's the one I talked about earlier. These come from the area of social sciences. These are ways that people, scientists will insert themselves to learn more about a culture, learn more about their social system, understand the people in that culture. So there are actual ways from social sciences you can apply to software to learn more about the emotional requirements. We're talking about getting emotional requirements as you build your software. Underlying discourse unveiling method. Weird name for the actual method that was used in that Brazilian social workers story I've been referring to. Finally, usability matrix of emotion, not a method to get emotional requirements, but a method to track them and organize them. Think about a graph or a table where down the left-hand side is all the features and functions that your system does, all the things that your system is and all the things that your system does. And along the top are the various emotions that you want to induce in your user. Maybe you got those through surveys and polls and questions. Then you just go across and you say, for this feature or function or the thing that the system is or does, we know that we want to make the users feel this way, that way, and the other way. And you fill out this table, and that way it will help you later as you're building the application to say, for this particular one, we know we want to make them feel this way. Which leads to the next part. We've talked about how to get emotional requirements. How do you induce those emotional requirements? How many developers do we have in the room? All right, this section's for you, and you're going to hate it. Because the answer is it's a case by case. I can't help you. Every single time that you've identified an emotional consideration, you said, this is the way, based on questionnaires and polls and surveys and observation, we've determined that we want to make this particular user feel this certain way in this particular context. The next question's how, and that's up to you to figure out. The answer is infinite. There's infinite ways. An example that comes from the video game industry. Perhaps at one point in the game, they decided that they want to make, it's a first-person shooter, they want to make the user feel afraid and vulnerable and scared. They said, okay, we've identified for this particular user, this is the emotions that we want to induce. How do we do that? Maybe they decide in the game to put them out in the open. There's no cover, nowhere for them to hide. That way, they're inducing those emotions in that particular user. So, but that's one small example. For other applications, other emotions, other targets, other users, other contexts, the answers are infinite. It's up to you to figure out how can we achieve this goal. Finally, design, develop, third parts test. I'm a lifelong tester, measuring emotional requirements. Outside the bounds of reality, what's the best way to measure emotions, to understand how someone feels? Talk to them outside of reality. What if reality we are not bounded by reality?
Measure their mind.
There we go. Telepathy. Wouldn't that be great? So we've gotten these emotional requirements. Oh, we want them to feel this way. We figured out how we think we can do it and induce it, and we build it, and we sit down and we say, use it. And as they're using the software, I'm reading their minds. And I'm like, oh, yes, we succeeded. They do feel that way. Unfortunately, we can't do that. That would be great. In fact, when you're trying to measure emotions, I've done deep research on this, there are no reliable or user-independent, not user-reported ways of measuring emotions. Now, there are some more recent technologies, oddly pursued by ad companies, that look at galvanic skin response, how much sweat is on your skin, and the electrical charge, because that can mean if you're sweaty, you're nervous. If you're not sweaty, you're less nervous. Contraction of your eye. If it's contracted, you're bored. If it's uncontracted, you might be interested. The tone and pitch of your voice, sweat. There's all sorts of different things. They tried to measure brain waves. All of these are trying to measure emotions. Now, if you have access to these ways, go for it. Build your application, and then hook them up to a machine that measures the sweat on their skin. That'd be fantastic. You can find out if they're emotionally responding the way that you want them to. But those are probably not feasible. So I'm going to go back to some more reasonable ways that you might have and that are accessible to you. And they're going to seem very similar because they're very similar to the way we get emotions. Interviews and discussions. So you've interviewed somebody beforehand. How do you want to feel? They told you. You think you've built an application that makes them feel that way. Have them use the application and then ask them afterwards, did it make you feel that way? Again, we're relying on self-report, but that's the best we got without telepathy or advanced technologies. Now, it depends on when you ask them. Maybe if somebody hated the application and you interview them right afterwards, they'll tell you that. But what if you're smart and you wait a week and they've cooled off? So timing matters. Consider all the different contextual considerations when you're talking to someone and asking them how did they feel. Again, when you're developing surveys and polls and questionnaires to find out how did you actually feel. Consider all the things that you considered while you were getting and eliciting the emotional requirements, again, while you're trying to measure them. Observation, again, watch out for the Hawthorne effect. You've built an application, you saw that they were frowning when they did it manually and smiling here. You give them the application, you say, I'm going to watch as you use this. And they're like, this guy's watching me, I'm not going to frown. Be aware that the Hawthorne effect, they might still hate that part of the application that they used to hate manually. They might hate it automatically, but they're not going to show you because of the Hawthorne effect. So there's ways around that, research that, learn that. Similarly, if you can't get to the users themselves, I suggested personas, pretend users to elicit requirements. Similarly, role play. Okay, you don't actually have access to that 40-year-old mother in Iowa, pretend that you're her. It's going to be very hard for me to pretend I'm that person. Perhaps with a reasonable persona in front of me and a little bit of creativity, it's the next best thing. If you don't have any other way and you say, how are we ever going to know if our intended user, that mother in Iowa, is going to feel the way we want? We can't talk to her, we can't observe her. I guess we're just going to have to try and imagine that we're that person. The best we can, because that's the best we got. And that's better than nothing. So these are not perfect, but they're better than nothing. Another way, DEQ, DEQ is the Discrete Emotions Questionnaire. This goes back to those 8 base emotions. So this is a questionnaire specifically designed to ask people about those anger, disgust, joy. How did you feel? The Rice Profile by Dr. Stephen Rice at Ohio State University expands those 8 emotions to 16, a specially designed questionnaire and interview that you can use, designed by this doctor, to evaluate people's emotional responses. Finally, PREMO, this is my favorite one, the Product Emotion product emotion measurement instrument. This one you can use to try and measure and gauge people's emotions using animated little avatars. So rather than saying, did you feel happy, and you have an advanced vocabulary, did you feel anticipation, it has a little avatar of a guy going. That sometimes is easier for people to understand by seeing something. So these are different ways, again, that you can try your best to measure emotions. We wanted to induce this particular emotion in this particular person in this context. Did we do it? You can use one of these techniques. And finally, track it all with that same usability matrix of emotions. Remember all the functions and features down the side, all the emotions? Try and you can use this to measure. Well, we wanted it to do these emotions, this particular feature. Did we? So this is a good tracking way. There are many methods to get and measure emotional requirements and infinite methods to induce them. I encourage you to take this bullet point list, go read, research, and bring it to your company, because the way we feel about software is important. Finally, placebos. I'm going to blow through this. This is like an hour and a half in the workshop, but I'll give you 10 minutes of it. Placebos comes from Latin, the Latin word placare, and placate as the root word. What happened is back in the long time ago, people used to die. And so they'd hire mourners. That sounded, yeah, no longer though. We're all. So back then when people would die, sometimes they would hire mourners to come to the funeral. And these mourners would read a series of verses. One of those verses was some Psalms 116, which says, I shall please the dead in the land of the living. And they would chant this Psalms 116. And the words I shall please is placare in Latin. So the placar, placate, these people that chanted this were called placebos. And they were looked down on because their emotions that they expressed at the funeral were not considered authentic or genuine because they were hired. They were there for money. They weren't really sad this person died. So even from its earliest form, the idea of placebo has had very negative connotations. So what is a placebo? It's anything or procedure that's intended solely for mental effects, but claims to also, and weirdly, spookily enough, may actually result in physical effects as well. Placebos are very, very not misunderstood, not understood because they only have about 30 to 40 years of research, which is very, very young. Doctors, scientists still do not properly understand how the placebo response or the placebo effect works. It's very spooky stuff. I'll get into some of the weird, this is part of the hour and a half. Placebos are fascinating. I'm using them today to talk about giving insight into software, but it's a fascinating topic. Placebo response is a beneficial physical effect seemingly caused by a placebo, but cannot be attributed to the physical properties of the placebo. This is by expectancy theory. Oftentimes people expect that they're going to feel a certain way, and so they feel that way, but weirdly enough, the brain is pretty powerful, and sometimes they actually do get better physically, not just mentally, not just the way they feel. Opposite of that is nocebo response. You give someone a sugar pill and you say, this is going to make you feel worse, and they feel worse. Think voodoo curse. That's a great example of the nocebo response. Somebody put a voodoo curse on me and I feel worse. Not only I feel worse, I actually have physical ailments, weirdly enough. The brain's powerful. Anyway, so why is this, how do we use placebos? 3 different ways. Clinical, to placate. I'll skim over this. Basically, lots and lots of doctors prescribe placebos. Lots of them. There's all kinds of studies that show. Is it ethical? I talk about ethics. It's very interesting, but it's not relevant today. Experimental to control. Double-blind placebo studies is the gold standard that the FDA uses to approve drugs nowadays. The way I'm more interested in how we use placebos is conditioning, to appease, to make someone accustomed to some. So what do I mean by that? Conditioning is feeling that you have control over your world. It's a desirable state. Alan Langer from Harvard. We all like to feel that we have, whether you think about it or are conscious of it, we like to feel that we control our world. That's called the locus of control. The locus of your control is the things that you actually control, that you have agency over. The illusion of control is the things that you believe you have control over, but you actually don't. But you want to feel like you're controlling your world, that you're not just a feather on the breeze, that there is free will. This is an important aspect for people. And this is why placebos are so important, because people want to have control over their environment. So let me give you some examples of placebos. Thermostats. Did you know in many, many, many office buildings, thermostats are bogus? They're not hooked up to any HVAC system. They're actually installed on the wall, but there's nothing behind them. Companies will sometimes install these because people say, the employees say, I'm cold or I'm hot, and they go, fine. And they're not going to pay for a new HVAC system. They'll throw one of these fake things up on Saturday. People roll in on Monday, and they go, ah. And they walk up, and they're chilly, and they turn that dial, and you know what? They feel warmer. They feel warmer. And they go, thank you for installing that. Things are great. Many thermostats are placebos. They are conditioning people to feel a certain way, although there is no function. Another example, Two examples, street crossing buttons, door closing buttons. You're in an elevator and you hit door close, guess what? Studies have shown many of those aren't connected. Same thing, half of the street crosswalk buttons don't do anything. Weirdly enough, after they tell people this button doesn't do anything, they go, oh, wow, that's wild. The studiers will come back the next day, see that same person, and they'll watch that same person press the button. They go, we told you yesterday the button's not connected. They go, I know, just in case. It's amazing. Plus, the mind, the idea that you have control over your universe is very important. This is why placebos are so effective. Now, in terms that we understand, progress bars, if you ever created or tried to implement one of these, you know it can be very difficult to estimate or predict how long something's going to take. So a lot of times they're just bogus. They're just little bars that actually extend and have no real connection to reality. They make people feel as if something's happening. There's all kinds of cool research that I talk about, spinners versus different waves and different ways you can present progress bars that make people feel differently. Refresh and save buttons. Our mobile apps are constantly on and they're always refreshing. There's a great online app called Sketch that used to have a save button, and you could draw something and save it, and eventually they got rid of the save button because they made it auto-save, always save. And users hated it, and they said, bring us back the save button. They're like, what? It's always saving. You'll never... And the users wanted it, so they added a save button back that wasn't hooked up to anything. And users like, thank goodness. Users want control. What about boo-boos? Anybody got kids here? Boo-boo kiss. I hurt my knee. And you look and there's nothing there. It hurts, it hurts. You kiss it. That's a form of placebo. So, how can placebos give us insight into software? 3 different ways I'll present very quickly. Isolating emotions. In science, if you're trying to run an experiment, sometimes it makes sense to isolate variables. If you have multiple variables, too many things changing at once, it's hard to tell what caused the effect. So you isolate certain variables. Similarly, if you think about the different things that your software is or your software does, and the emotional considerations, that's 3 different things that you might have to be considering at once. What if you imagine that any feature or function in your application was just a placebo, and the only reason it existed was like that door close button, to affect emotion? Sometimes imagining that some function or property is just a placebo can help you better consider the intended emotions that it should induce. One way that placebos can give you insight as you're developing your emotional considerations, emotional requirements. Next, bugs. Of course, it's easy to recognize a functional bug. The product or system should do this, and it does not do that. Bug. It should perform this way, it doesn't. Bug. But what about an emotional bug? What if it says the product should induce happiness in this user? And the user uses it and they say, I felt happy. You're like, okay, that doesn't seem like a bug to me. What if the user says, I felt sad? You're like, okay, well, it was supposed to make them feel happy. It's supposed to induce that. It in fact made them feel sad. I'd call that a bug. So far, so good. What if the user said, I did it and it made me feel ecstatic? Is that a bug? What if in the video game you're trying to make the user feel vulnerable and a little bit scared by putting them in the open, and some people are so terrified they lock themselves in the closet? Is that a bug? What if repeated use of the placebo, of the particular feature or function changes over time? Like somebody turns the thermostat and they go, I feel better, but they're actually not warmer. So a little bit later they're just as cold, and they turn it again, and they go, that's better, no, and 10 minutes later they're still not any warmer, and every time they turn it more and more, now they're getting angrier and angrier. The first time they used it they felt happy, which was the intent. And the 9th time they turn it and they're still not feeling happier, now they're getting angry. So repeated use, is that a bug? Things to consider. Consider various scenarios to help determine intended and unintended results when thinking about emotional considerations, emotional requirements. Final one, ethics. This is a super fascinating one, I got to gloss over it. The general idea is placebos are essentially lying to people. The door close button, the elevator door close button, the door cross the street button. A great example of this is Coinstar. You dump a big thing of coins into the machine and it spits out a little receipt that you can exchange for paper money. Have you seen those in the grocery store? When they first came out with these, people were skeptical and suspicious of the machines because they dump in a big thing of coins, boop, it spits out a receipt. They're like, well, that happened way too quick. There's no way this is accurate. And they went and they did diagnostics on the machine, and they're like, no, these are actually, the number of change in the machine is equal to the amount we've paid out. People are like, they don't believe it. So you know what they did? They built in a fake delay. A fake delay, just to make people go, that took 2 minutes, this must be right. That is ethically, that is lying to users for an ethical reason. They want users to feel a certain way. Same thing with Netflix. Sometimes a note will go out and your recommended movies aren't really your recommended movies. They're generically recommended movies. But rather than saying, we have a note down and reporting of an error, they'll present something generic because it makes you feel a certain way. So consider intentionally deceiving users for their benefit. It sounds wild, and this is a much larger section, unfortunately, I can't get into. But sometimes intentionally deceiving users. Remember that one study said that the emotional response is the most important factor to consider when creating software to determine whether users embrace or reject it. Sometimes it makes sense to look at the ethical question and intentionally deceive your users to achieve that goal. So, thinking about software in terms of placebos can be useful. The summary slide. Some successful businesses and people recognize the importance of emotion. Purpose of software is to affect emotion. All software everywhere. Research indicates that emotional requirements can influence the acceptance of software and should be considered. This is the point of today. Requirements are simply wants or needs. The words themselves can make us feel different ways. And if you dig down enough, all requirements probably come from some core emotion. There are many different methods to get and measure emotional requirements. I've given you a few bullet point high-level ones to go and research on your own. Thinking about software in terms of placebos might be insightful and useful as you think about introducing emotional requirements at your company. The way we feel about software is important. I'm Damian Synadinos. Thank you. Keep exploring. Thank you.